Okay, um, I'm back, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I'm going to have to go back and see if I can't invite some folks to a different stream because I cannot get to the stream that I invited everyone to join us on this afternoon. So we're just going to see if I can't get this new stream out there pretty quick. And we're going to be talking about the 70 AD doctrine this afternoon, and would love to hear from you if you have any questions or comments. Um, try to get some information presented regarding this particular doctrine out there so people can know what it is, because people in Central Arkansas, to be honest with you, don't have much of an idea of what I'm talking about when I say 70 AD doctrine. I know that up in Ohio, Indiana, and other places, especially up north and Midwest, the doctrine is gaining traction, it's gaining ground, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. You know, inoculation is very important. You know, prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So if we keep that in mind and the need to discuss this, well, I think that we'll all be benefited from it. I'm trying to do three things at once, not just two. Two is hard enough, but three, that's a whole different ball game. Uh, See, I can't even type and talk at the same time. So we're going to see how this works. It's going to be listed as the nature of saving faith. And anyway, it's out there. I advertised on a bunch of different pages, and the link just doesn't work. So if you are tuned into our website, you can catch us right now on the nature of saving faith link, not the new one. So in fact, I'm going to see if that won't come up right now. Yep, there we are. Actually, no, it's not working there either. Frustrating. It's going back to the program that we just recorded. That's what's playing on the link. So, how frustrating. I'll know next time not to set up two separate links. I'll just set up one link and we can go from there. And just continue the radio program. Nope, it's not coming up. It's not there. Well, you have to go to our YouTube page in order to get us. Have to go to the YouTube page in order to get us. That's the only way that it's going to be made visible. So, all right, well, welcome. If you are joining us, we're going to be talking about the 70 AD doctrine for the next few minutes. James Hamilton is not with me this afternoon. He was supposed to be here, so I'm flying solo, and that's part of the trouble, I guess. Anyway, what is the 70 AD doctrine? Let's get started, and let's see if we can figure this out. First of all, the 70 AD doctrine is a doctrine that's relatively new, I guess you could say. It has a recent history. A fellow by the name of Matt King really propagated it in his book, The Spirit of Prophecy. And so to define what this doctrine is, it maintains that all prophecy has been fulfilled. All scriptural prophecy has been fulfilled, and it was fulfilled in AD 70. That was the completion of all of biblical prophecy. Nothing, therefore, is to be fulfilled after 70 AD. Nothing. The Bible doesn't deal with any event, according to this doctrine, after 70 AD. Prior to 70 AD, everything was working and culminating to be fulfilled by 70 A.D. This doctrine is also referred to as realized eschatology. It is a doctrine that, as you look up the word preterist, it's a person who maintains that the prophecies in the apocalypse have already been fulfilled. By the way, that means Revelation. Even the book of Revelation was all fulfilled in 70 A.D. Tim King, the son of Max King, created a new word to describe this particular eschatological view. That is transmillennialism, to go along beside of. But really their idea is that the millennium, as they understood it and understand it, was about the transitional period between the old law and the new covenant, and was completed and fulfilled in 70 A.D. Everything was fulfilled by 70 A.D. And you may find that a little hard to wrap your head around. You may find it difficult to believe. In fact, regarding this word transmillennialism, by 1999, we began to look long term. I'm quoting from Tim King. He says, at what it would take to extend Max's research as a second generation and prepare the church for the postmodern age. In the summer of 1999, we invented a new word, transmillennialism. As a new term, this could stand beside pre-A or A and post-millennialism. The final forms that had developed in Christian eschatology, unlike traditional dogma, transmillennialism sees Christ's millennial reign in its first century context from the Old to the New Covenant, bringing about the transformation of the ages. It sees the thrust of the Bible speaking about how heaven comes to earth, not primarily about how one gets to heaven. Well, that's an interesting concept in and of itself. So it's not about getting to heaven. It's about the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and at 70 AD, I guess heaven came to earth. Well, not that I've noticed. How about you? But anyway, what about this doctrine? What is the main tenets of it? And what does it mean? If it says that all prophecy has been fulfilled by 70 AD, then that means the second coming of Christ has already occurred. That means that the resurrection from the dead has already taken place. That means that the new heavens and the new earth has already been established and fulfilled. The end of the world has already happened, my friend, according to this doctrine. That's what it means. All these things have been fulfilled. And there are some evident problems with this particular doctrine. Well, how do they get there? I think that's a really good question. How do they get there? I want to suggest to you there are some logical fallacies that are that have to be used in order to get there. Not illogical fallacies. They're not logical, but logical fallacies leading to this doctrine. One thing I came to my mind, have you ever heard of pigeonholing? I think we all have. You try to put all these things into one box, even though they may not fit, we have to shove them in there. We have to put them in one box. Well, when we force a term or a phrase to mean, the same thing in every single context that it's used, even though it may very well be used differently in each context. And by the way, there are a lot of terms and phrases in the Scripture that are used differently in different contexts. But what they do is they take a term or a phrase, regardless of its context, and they force the same exact meaning or the same exact referenced event into the same box. The judgment. The Bible speaks actually of several different judgments. You have the judgment of the world in Genesis chapter 6. You have the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. You have the judgment of God upon Jerusalem. Yeah, Matthew 24. And I will say this, my friend, I believe that much prophecy was indeed fulfilled in 70 A.D. Matthew 24 and the prophecy of Jesus there clearly has reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. And there are other passages in the New Testament which reference the destruction of Jerusalem. But to say that all such passages and all such references point to 70 A.D. is wrong. It's just wrong. The coming of Jesus Look, I understand that Jesus told the chief priest that he would see him coming in clouds, power. And there's no question in my mind that Jesus came in judgment upon Jerusalem. I believe that. But he did not come visibly. He did not come personally. He did not come and receive all men to himself. And the judgment did not take place then. That was a local judgment upon a city and a people and their religious system. It was not a worldwide judgment. The coming of Jesus and the judgment, they try to cram all into AD 70, the end of the world. It is true that 70 AD marked the end of the Jewish system. It marked the end of many prophetic references in the Old Testament. The book of Daniel is filled with them, where he's pointing to 70 AD. Okay, Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 12. I believe that that's exactly what Daniel is pointing to. From the time that Jesus is crucified on the cross, and the fulfillment of that prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. I accept that. But you can't take every other passage, especially those in the New Testament, which talk about an eventual second coming of Christ to judge the world, and try to shove it all into the same hole. That's pigeonholing. Another logical fallacy that is committed is that they try to spiritualize everything. They take literal terms and context and try to make them figurative. And in reality, what they do is they kind of do some word games, and the real contrast is between that which is literal and that which is figurative. Well, they try to put literal and spiritual together. And I believe that just because something is spiritual does not mean that it's not literal. I believe that I believe that the spiritual realm is more real than the physical realm. But that's what they do. They try to mingle terms. They try to spiritualize everything. For example, the resurrection that Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. They claim that that's just a spiritual resurrection. Okay, just a spiritual resurrection. What they mean really is a figurative resurrection. In fact, I've been asked by some, have you never been resurrected? Have you not been resurrected? I said, no, not actually. Not actually. I have been born again. I have been raised to walk in newness of life. I have been made spiritually alive. Yes. But that's what they try to make 1 Corinthians 15 talk about, just the spiritual life that one has in Christ. And it's not talking about a bodily resurrection, according to them. So they try to spiritualize it. There's no actual resurrection of the dead. In other words, all who have died physically, they will not be raised in the future. According to them, the resurrection has already passed. It's fulfilled. And so that's a grave error, a grave mistake. And of course, to me, that's one of the easiest things. If you just stay in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it's, I believe, very easy to demonstrate how false this doctrine is. They also redefine terms. And of course, these terms have to fit within their paradigm. They take terms like death. In fact, I've seen several articles written recently on death. What is death? Trying to define what death is. And one even made the point that he always thought that spiritual death, was separation from God. And he tries to explain how that's not the case. Well, the word death literally does mean separation. That's what the idea means. To physically die means that your body and spirit are separated from one another. That's what happened with Jesus on the cross. When he died, his body and spirit were separated. His body was placed in a tomb, Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, and then his spirit went to Hades. And as he told the thief on the cross, today I will be with you in paradise. But they try to take the term death and redefine redefine it. The term life, they try to spiritualize everything. Like in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul is not talking about physical death. He's certainly not talking about a literal resurrection of the body. So they have to redefine the term death. They have to redefine the term life. They have to redefine the term resurrection. And so they play with the words in such a way that they just make them mean absolutely nothing when you're all said and done, except what they want them to mean. Another term, there's a Greek term, melo, which in some cases is translated at hand. And we'll get into some of this later, but the meaning is multiple. I mean, yes, it can mean at hand or nearby, but it also can simply mean one who has the authority and is ready to judge, to come, to do whatever it is that they're going to do. Will come. God will come. The word will is translated from the same Greek word in that very context. And that's something that we'll be talking about. We'll have to get into this word melo a little bit and define it as we go through our study. But another thing that they do is they force passages that clearly refute their doctrine into their paradigm, even if they have to just cut them all to pieces and ignore them, whatever it takes. For example, the book of Revelation. Now, their contention is that the book of Revelation was written prior to 70 AD. Of course, it would have to. Of course, every book has to be written before 70 AD. Not a single inspired book could have been written after 70 AD and their theory be correct. It would blow their theory out of the water if just one book was written after 70 AD. Because in their mind, everything in the scripture was fulfilled by 70 AD. So the whole book of Revelation, by the way, where it's talking about the Roman emperors, and it talks about specifically Nero and Domitian. Of course, it's not talking about Nero personally. It's talking about the reincarnated Nero, who is Domitian. So he's talking about future events from 70 AD. There's no question about that. But they have to reinterpret all of these books. They have to reinterpret the entire book of Revelation in its entire message and apply it strictly to 70 AD and everything from 70 AD backwards. It can't apply to anything past 70 AD. That's just wrong. So you have to force a passage to mean something that it clearly doesn't mean. 1 Corinthians 15 regarding the resurrection. Jesus is the first fruit, the first fruits of the resurrection. He's the first fruits. Isn't it clear that the Apostle Paul makes the point that we too will be resurrected like he was? He was the first fruits, so therefore we will follow. In fact, the doctrine that the Apostle Paul is dealing with in 1 Corinthians, the objection of some of the Corinthians was that there is no resurrection. Now, they didn't deny the personal resurrection of Jesus. They simply denied that we would be resurrected, which doesn't really follow. But Paul then makes an argument from the resurrection of Christ that if he has not been raised, then we're all still dead in our sins. But he then makes the point that we too will be raised. Our bodies will be changed. Our bodies will become fitted for immortality. And they have to spiritualize all of these, make all of this figurative. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is another passage. I mean, the man of sin and the things that the Apostle Paul talks about, who I do believe is it's clearly not a reference to Nero, but someone who would come after. It's interesting how, because it talks about there must be an apostasy first, and how do you define or describe all of these things? How do you defend this doctrine in light of what the Scriptures clearly teach? Another fallacy that is made, the contention. In fact, this is one of the fundamental or foundational principles of this doctrine, that the Old Covenant overlapped with the New Covenant. In other words, there was a period of about 40 years in which both covenants were in effect at the same time. In fact, Max Keene wrote in the Spirit of Prophecy on page 367, A failure to recognize the overlapping of the Old and New Covenant has created a third age or world that really doesn't exist in Scripture. A failure to recognize the overlapping of the Old and New Covenant. So what he does is he has the Old Testament age coming up to the death of Christ. And then you have another age. This is the last days, if you will, from the death of Christ to the destruction of Jerusalem, and that's it. So you got a 40-day age there is what you got. All right? Doesn't make a lot of sense just from that perspective, but let's think about what the Scriptures say. And by the way, there are a few passages that are used to try to support this idea. In Hebrews, the 8th chapter, and verse 13, we have one such passage. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13. Of course, chapter 8 is dealing with the new covenant that Jeremiah had promised and prophesied in Jeremiah chapter 31. But it says, beginning there in verse 13, he says, in that he says a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So he says, okay, see, there's proof that there's an overlapping of the two covenants. Now, just for clarification, let me make this point. It is true that there were Jews who were continuing to keep the law of Moses. Okay, that entire 40 years, yes, they were striving to keep the law of Moses. They had their priestly system still intact. They were still offering sacrifices at the temple. They were still going through all of the ceremonial rituals of the old law. That was still going on. I'm not going to deny that. But I will tell you this right now, those were not effectual. The old law had been nailed to the cross, right? The old law had come to an end already. Now, the external manifestation of the keeping of that law was still going on, but it had absolutely no effect or no benefit. It was not effectual at all. It had already come to an end. Another passage that is used to defend this view is found in the book of Galatians in the 4th chapter, verses 21 through 31, and the allegory of Isaac and Ishmael, or Sarah and Hagar. And the argument goes like this, beginning in verse 21, tell me, you who desires to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondwoman, the other by a free woman, but he was of the bondwoman. Let me back up here. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise, which things are symbolic. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, and the one which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Now, of course, Dan King and others make the argument then that there was a brief time in which the son of the bondwoman, Ishmael, lived with the son of the free woman, Isaac. They were in the same household. And so, therefore, that proves that there was an overlapping of the covenants. That's not the point that Paul's making, my friend. Paul's making a totally different point than that. The point is that in fact, Ishmael was never of promise. Ishmael was, there is a type in which Ishmael was a type of the old covenant, and Isaac a figure of the new covenant. That's true. You know, one of the problems that so many people get themselves into is that they take types or shadows and they try to press certain aspects of a type and shadow and try to enforce or try to make a doctrinal stance or commitment or statement from that particular figure or type, and that really has no bearing on the point that's being made. Well, that's what they're doing with this. It's kind of like taking a parable of Jesus and trying to make a point or an application of every single detail in a parable. You can't do that. You'll miss the whole point. And that's exactly what they've done with Isaac and Ishmael. They've missed the whole point. Ishmael was never a son of promise. Yes, he was a type of the old law. And Paul's point about Ishmael persecuting Isaac, well, that's exactly what the Jews were doing. But the covenant, that doesn't mean that the covenant was still in effect at that time. That's not Paul's point at all. In fact, to prove that, there are several passages that we can use to demonstrate that's just flat out not the case. In Romans chapter 7 and verse 1 beginning down through verse 6, or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives? For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she is released from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband lives, she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. Therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, that you may be married to another. Now see, if the law was still in effect, you could not be married. You could not be married to Christ. You could not be joined to Christ. Hold on just a second. Let me check this. Okay, that's what I figured. Okay, what was I saying? If the law was still in effect, if the old covenant was still in existence, you could not then be joined to Christ. Isn't that Paul's point? For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were in our members to bear fruit to death, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit to death. But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. It's interesting. Very interesting. We've got a call.
We should serve
yes.
in the Spirit and not in the oldness.
Thank you so much.
I'm on the air with you.
Hello? Yes, you're on the air, or sort of, I think.
Okay. Is there a delay? Because I thought you were talking about Romans 7 there.
Yes, there is a delay probably from what you're hearing. Yes, but I was. Go ahead.
Okay, Romans 7:4. Are you with me?
Yes.
Okay. They had died to the law, not that the law was dead. The law was still in effect, or they could not have been dying to it. That's what Paul is saying there.
Oh.
The law was still in effect. They were dying to the law. You have become dead to the... How could they become dead to the law? Romans 6, verses 3 through 6.
Okay.
They were being baptized. They were being buried into the death of Jesus Christ, rising to walk in newness of life through baptism.
So
through Christ, they were dying to the old covenant law.
So if
that's
a woman,
exactly what that's talking about.
So if a woman was married to another man, if she divorced him, then she died to her husband, so she's free to marry another man, but her husband is actually still alive, and the covenant's still in effect. Is that what you're saying?
So they were dying to the law through their baptism, so that they could be married to Christ.
Well, I understand.
Christ,
yes, they were dying
through their baptism. They were dying to the old covenant Israel, so they could now become Christians.
But the law was still in effect. If I understand what you're saying, the law was still alive.
Absolutely.
Okay. So
yes.
Okay. So you make the comparison to the man and the woman. Okay. So the woman's husband was still alive, but she was just dead to him, so she was able to marry another man.
Say that again. You're breaking up on me.
Okay, so what you're saying is the illustration that Paul gives, the woman just died to her husband, although her husband was still alive and she married another man, she could still be married to that other man because she simply died to the husband, although the husband was still alive.
Yeah, well, the woman would die to the law, right? And then if she's dead,
she died to the law.
She died to the law of her husband. Now she can remarry.
Okay, so she died to the law of her husband, of the law that joined her to her husband. Okay, when did it cease? When did her husband die?
Well, it depends on who's dying when. Let's look at
when did she have a right? When did she have a right to be married to another man?
Hang on. Let's look at it this way. Hebrews 8:13 said, that the old covenant was waxing old, decaying, right, and was ready to vanish away. That was written about 64, 65 AD.
Right. I'll agree with that.
So the old covenant was ready to vanish away.
Now, well, there are two words there. First of all, it has been made obsolete, number one. Secondly, yes, it was ready to vanish away. I've already explained that you did have the external manifestations of the law still going on, but those sacrifices and those workings that were carried out at the temple by the priest had absolutely no spiritual benefit for those people.
Yes, it certainly did. That's exactly why Paul and the Jewish convert Christians of that day were still keeping the law.
Well,
want me to show you that in Acts 21?
Well, yeah, I know Paul did go. He had made an oath, and yes, he went down to the temple. But that was so that because he had been accused of teaching that the law had ceased and had stopped, and so he's just trying to mend fences so that he can. This is an example, I believe, of the Apostle Paul becoming a Jew so that he could teach the Jew.
Acts 21, verse 20. All James, the elders, the apostles, all those who believed, the Jewish converts that believed in Christianity, that became believers, they were all zealous of the law and keeping the law. And Paul went and took even 3 or 4 other fellows under the Nazarite vow, and they were all worshiping that way. They're all keeping the law.
Yeah, they'd all made oaths.
Acts 15, verse 4.
Paul did not have to do that in order to be right with God. He did that so that he could talk with them and teach them. He didn't do that because he had to.
Yeah, Galatians chapter 5, verse 3.
So you're saying that Paul
said,
had
whoever
to.
of you is circumcised, you're debtor to keep the whole law.
That is correct. If you're circumcised.
All right. So the Jews.
Hold on, whoa. Galatians chapter 5. You are debtor to keep the whole law. And he makes the point. You have been severed from Christ.
No, that's not what he says. You are debtor to keep the whole law. He said, but whosoever you are justified by that law, you have become severed to Christ. So the law couldn't justify them, but they had to keep it or it condemned them.
If you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. And I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. In other words, you can't sin one single time.
Yeah. No. He's making a distinction between the Jew and the Gentile, that if the Gentiles went and got circumcised, that's not going to help them one bit. But those who were already circumcised, you're debtor to keep the whole law.
No, that's not what he's saying,
That's exactly
Steve.
what he's talking about there. And he just come off of Galatians chapter 4 talking about the bond and the free woman being together, and he leads right into this.
If you're saying then, if you were circumcised, if you were the Apostle Paul, then you would be a debtor to keep the whole law. That was what you were still bound by. That's what you're saying.
You're a debtor to keep the whole law. But it would not justify you.
Well, you're right. It wouldn't justify you. And in fact, it would cause you to be lost because he says
but they had to keep it.
If you become estranged from Christ, you who attempt to be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace.
Can I give you an illustration of how that works, Don?
Sure.
Okay. The laws of the land. Are we debtor to keep the laws of the land of the United States of America, provided they do not contradict Jesus' law?
Sure. Romans chapter 13.
That's exactly right. Okay, so we're debtor to keep the laws of the land, but the laws of the land can't justify us. We can't say because we kept the laws of the land that we've been justified. But we've got to keep the law of the land. That's exactly what was happening to the Jews then. they had to keep that law, but that law could not justify them because Jesus said, not one jot or tittle of the law shall cease till all be fulfilled in Matthew chapter 5, verse 18, 19.
Yes, which I guess you already know that I believe that he fulfilled that when he died on the cross and established the covenant.
Well, that can't be so. Yeah. That can't be so. He said till every jot and tittle of the law be fulfilled. It would every jot and tittle of the law would remain. He did not fulfill it all on the cross.
Yeah, I believe he did fulfill that part of the law. What he's talking about on the cross, yes.
No, he's talking about every jot and tittle. He said till heaven and earth pass away, even to emphasize the point. The verse before, he said, think not that I'm coming to destroy the law and the prophets. Think not that I come to destroy. I come to fulfill it. Fulfill what? The law and the prophets. Yes. Every jot and tittle of it.
Yes.
And until every jot and tittle of the law be fulfilled.
What he said was that he had come to fulfill the law. The law was pointing to him, and they prophesied of his coming, his death, his sacrifice. He fulfilled the law in those things.
No, he did not fulfill all that he did. Was it prophesied of him coming a second time without sin unto salvation? Did he fulfill that? Did the Old Testament talk about at his coming how he would destroy Jerusalem? Did he fulfill that at the cross? That's Zechariah 14:1. That's Deuteronomy 32. That's the law and the prophets. It's Isaiah 65.
Yeah,
see what you've got. You've got a whole different thing than what they had then. You're looking at it. Not even considering audience relevance, Don.
Well, I respectfully disagree with you on two counts. Number one, all means all is defined by the context, and all the things that he came to fulfill were the things of the prophecies that referenced him and his sacrifice, and he fulfilled those. And the law would be in effect. Every jot and tittle would be in effect until he had fulfilled those things, which he did.
That's right. And
as Colossians chapter 2,
when Jerusalem was destroyed.
As Colossians chapter 2 and verses 13 through 15 tell us very clearly, he nailed those things to the cross, past tense. He had.
No. Let's go there carefully. Colossians 2,
Ephesians
12,
2, 13 through 16
he's talking about
as well.
Those who were baptized, okay? Follow your pronouns. Those who were baptized. For us, he took.
Hadn't Paul been baptized?
He took the
hadn't Paul been baptized?
And the things against us and nailed them to the cross for us. Who? Those who were baptized. Verse 12. In fact, in verse 17 of Colossians 2, it says there that the law was still a shadow. It's still working. The Sabbath days, the new moons, the feast days were still working there.
Well, they were still
Colossians 2:17. How could it have been nailed to the cross if it's still working?
They were still being practiced by the Jews, but they were not being practiced by the Christians.
Paul said it was still working, and those things which were nailed to the cross was for those who had been baptized. Follow the pronouns from chapter 2, verse 12, verse 12 through verse 14. For those who had been baptized, their sins had been nailed to the cross, which, by the way, is Romans 7:4, back where we started. Through their dying in baptism, they were freed to be married to Christianity.
Well, your whole argument on Romans chapter 7, I've already demonstrated, cannot be true, because if that's the case, then the husband was still alive, and the woman was she was married to another man. And if someone was married to Christ while the law was still alive, then that person would be a spiritual adulterer. So your argument falls completely apart in Romans chapter 7.
Chapter 6 through 13.
Your argument in Galatians chapter 5 also
God
falls
was putting
completely
Israel
apart.
to death.
Yeah. Well,
but he's going to bring her back to life. The new Israel, the heavenly Jerusalem.
So
that's what the church is. We are the Israel of God, the heavenly Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem.
When was she freed to marry another man? You went back to Romans 7.
All right, she died to the law through baptism, and that freed her from it. She rose to walk in newness of life.
But her husband
was resurrected.
But her husband was still alive.
So that she could then marry somebody else.
But her husband was still alive.
Yep, she died to him.
She died to him.
She died. That breaks the marriage contract.
How did she die to him?
Through baptism, Romans 6:3-6, buried with him through death.
So,
having buried the dead body of sin, rising to walk in new life.
Do you believe that baptism puts to death adulterous marriages?
No, I do not.
Okay. Well, then, again, your argument falls flat.
No, it does not.
It doesn't work there, sir.
We're not talking. We're talking about the Do you disagree that at a baptism that the person has buried their dead body in sin and rose to walk in newness of life, or do you think that, do you not agree with that?
I agree. I agree that we die to sin and we are raised to walk in newness of life. I agree with that. Okay.
Okay. So what did you bury? So what did you bury in your baptism?
What did you bury? Well, you were buried. You were buried in baptism.
What part of you? What body of you was buried in your baptism?
Well, Colossians chapter 2 says we were buried with him in baptism.
Verse 5 and 6. Yep. Having buried the body of sin.
That you come into contact and you're united with Christ. Okay, so the woman in Romans chapter 4, she was united with a husband even though her first husband was still alive.
She died, though. She was free from the law that she could marry another. And the
law was still alive.
Because
Hebrews the law was still alive, Steve. It was
Hebrews
still
8:13, Acts 21, Acts 15. They're still keeping the law. Paul and all the Christian converts were still keeping the law.
Well, sure. You know what? I don't question even that. Well, this is my opinion. I suspect that the Apostle Paul never ate a pork chop in his whole life. Okay. But that, again, was not a violation of the New Covenant. He didn't have to eat pork chop in order to be right with God, but that's what he had always been taught, and certainly there were some things that carried over that they continued to do. But Paul makes it extremely clear that they were not to keep the old law. Circumcision was not required. Physical, fleshly circumcision was not required for anybody, Jew or Gentile.
Let's talk about the dietary laws changing for just a moment. When was the new dietary law given, Don?
I believe that as the Apostle Peter saw in his vision, that God has made all things clean. And it was made abundantly clear to Peter on that day. And that's what, 10, 12 years
I agree with you. I agree. Do you now realize you've got the giving of that 12 to 15 years after Pentecost? They didn't receive that law? They were still keeping the old law until he was given that. You just proved my point, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
It's not so much a law. It's that you are released. It's made clear that you are released from that law. It would not have been a sin for Peter to have eaten a pork chop that morning before he received the vision, if he understood that God had made all things clean.
Sin is transgression of the law. If they didn't have it then it wasn't given then. Sin is 1 John 3:4. Sin is transgression of the law. So if they didn't have the law then it wasn't wrong then until they got the law. When did it become a law? And
it would have
AD 45.
It would have been wrong. It would have been wrong if the law was still in effect. It would have been wrong even after Peter had received that vision, according to you, because the law would have still been in effect. So if you broke the law any time prior to 70 A.D., am I right? If any Jew broke the law, then you would have been guilty of sin and condemned by that.
They had to keep it, but it couldn't justify them.
They had to keep it, but it couldn't justify them. So why would they keep it?
That's right. It couldn't justify them, but they had to keep it. That's exactly right. Just like the laws of the land of the United States of America. You've got to keep it.
Okay.
But it can't justify you.
I think
it can condemn you.
Actually, I think you just made
it cannot justify you.
I think you actually just made my point. Okay.
Okay. Well, if that's what you want to say, but
yeah, because
you couldn't keep the law in Jerusalem anymore after it was destroyed, could you?
This is how you made my point. Okay, the laws of the land cannot justify you, right? It can't justify you. Okay, and keeping the laws of the land has no spiritual benefit to me whatsoever, right? Okay, the same thing would be true with a Jew after the death of Christ on the cross. To keep the law would have been no spiritual benefit to them whatsoever. Now, certainly they did, in many cases, kept certain aspects of the law. That's what their culture suggested. That's what the laws of the land were at that time.
That was their civil law. That's right.
And those things, clearly, they continued on. But they were not spiritual in nature. They did not have any spiritual requirement or responsibility to keep the law of Moses because it had been nailed to the cross. It had no spiritual efficacy whatsoever.
It was not.
Just like the laws of the land.
The things that were nailed to the cross were the things for those who had been baptized into Christ, their sins, those things which was contrary to them. He took those things and nailed those things to the cross. You're trying to use it universally, but the pronouns there refute that. It's talking about those who were just baptized 2 verses earlier. Colossians 2:12.
In him you
for
were
those who
also
have been
circumcised.
baptized. Read that text, Colossians
the
2:12
sins,
through
the
14.
sins of
Read
your
it closely.
flesh
Follow the pronouns.
Yeah, the sins of your flesh have been cut off. That's, of course, the circumcision of Christ. That's when you were forgiven of your sins, and through your faith in the working of God, you submit yourself to be buried with him in baptism, and you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all your trespasses. That's how you were made alive. He forgave you. Having wiped out,
I'm with you.
Having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, plural.
Who? Us. That's right. Those who were baptized. Thank
you. Past tense, was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it, singular.
Yes.
It, singular. What did he nail to the cross? The law of requirements that were held
that were
against
contrary
us.
to those who were baptized, us.
The law,
Christians.
No, he nailed to the cross
which is
the
why
law
in verse 17,
of requirements.
Which is why in verse 17 he said it was still working then. Yeah. The feast days and the moons and Sabbath days would continue, not one jot or tittle of it should cease, to all be fulfilled.
Okay, so verse 15
and
says,
it was still working in verse 17. Read verse 17.
Hold on.
16, 17.
Let's work our way there. Verse 15, he says, having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. So let no one judge you in food or drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath. In other words, no one can condemn them for not keeping the law. Why? Only because they've been baptized into Christ, therefore they were.
No one could condemn them for keeping it.
That's like that woman who had been divorced from her husband and she marries another man. No one should be able to say that she's an adulterer as long as her husband's alive.
No one, Don, could condemn them for keeping it either.
If her husband was still alive, then someone could condemn her. Just like if the law was still alive, someone could condemn them.
The next verse says,
which are a shadow of
that
things
those Sabbath
to come.
days were still present tense working.
But the substance is of Christ. The law was a shadow of the things that were to come. And
when
Jesus,
Paul wrote Colossians, it was then present tense still. A shadow of things to come. It's no longer a shadow of things to come now because it has come.
The law was a shadow of things to come in reference even to the death of Christ in this context and the nailing of these things to the cross. These things that were being nailed, or these things that were shadows.
So your argument now is that Christ wasn't crucified either yet then? That doesn't make sense. That's not going to work.
No, but it's inclusive of it. And the terminology here, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ, is having to do with all the things that Christ provides through his cross.
I'll tell you what I'd like to do. Let's you and I, and I'm a little crunched. I got to go to work. I work evenings. I got to go to work in just a few minutes, and I wouldn't cut you short. I challenge you to a public debate. Let's debate this publicly, public oral debate, or we can even do it over the phone. I'd like to get a better phone connection. Let's do it better. Let's have another format where we can discuss this. We'll each have equal time. We'll address these things in a good manner. What do you say?
Well, we'll see. Like I've already told you, this summer, don't know what's going to happen yet. We've still got some things in the work, and I can't commit to anything because I've already got a prior commitment. So, and the timing and all of that the timing and all that has not been nailed down yet. So I'm going to have to wait and see what shakes out with that, and then we'll see what happens from there.
Okay,
and
fine.
At the very least,
and I don't know that you told me that before.
And let me mention that before.
Let me say this:
at the very least, next Monday afternoon, we're going to do this again, and we'll be glad to talk about this some more.
Okay. Can we do it then on your radio program, or is it on radio and on the internet, or is this just on the internet?
This is just on the internet. Our radio program starts at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, and it's just a 30-minute broadcast.
Okay, then.
Then on Monday afternoons, we're going to start doing this at least for an hour, and perhaps even longer, depending on how long it takes. But we're going to discuss various doctrines and various false doctrines, and we're going to look at several different things. So,
all right, let's talk about the false AD 33 doctrine when we get a chance. We'll go through that.
That sounds great.
All right, thank you for allowing me to call. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for calling. Glad you listened.
Oh,
yes, sir.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, that was Steve Baisden, by the way. If If anyone's out there listening and did not know that, he didn't introduce himself, and I just knew that from the caller ID because he never said who he was, but I knew who he was. Nevertheless, interesting, very interesting, because I've got a lot of other things I'd like to ask him, and we kind of got stuck in the book of Galatians in chapter 5 and Romans chapter 7, which I think is very telling. But the shadow of things to come, but the substances of Christ. The law was a shadow of things to come. The law was. Doesn't mean that it was still a shadow of things yet to come. It was a shadow of things to come. That would include Christ. That would include his sacrifice. That would include everything, the gospel that was presented in Acts chapter 2, all of it. So the law was a shadow of things to come from its perspective. Interesting. But anyway, now you can maybe see a little bit more about why this is so interesting. I didn't get to talk about Galatians 3:23 through 29 or chapter 5 verses 1 through 6. Romans chapter 7, though, it's interesting that the position that Mr. Baisden took on Romans chapter 7. I still don't know that he truly understood what his argument was there. But anyway, let me quickly just make this point, and then we're going to close out today's study. Appreciate very much those who've listened, and this is going to be made available. I'm going to have to change some things on my streaming next time, so we get the right link and everything, so everybody who's invited can actually listen, because this time that did not happen. The link that I tried to connect with, it would not connect. It kept going back to my previous link, and so anyway, I'm glad Steve found us at least. I don't know how he did, but I'm so glad that he did. And Lord willing, next Monday afternoon, we're going to do this again, and we're going to talk about these things a little bit more in detail. So thank you so much for tuning in this afternoon, and Lord willing, we'll be back next Monday to talk about these things. By the way, tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, we're going to continue our study on saving faith. What does it mean to call on the name of the Lord? That's what we're going to be looking at tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. on our Searching for the Truth radio broadcast at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. Hope that you can join us then. Until then, may God bless you and have a great rest of the day.